Section 55 of Curiosities of Literature, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. Curiosities of Literature, Volume 2 by Isaac Disraeli. Introduction of Tea, Coffee, and Chocolate. It is said that the frozen Norwegians, on the first sight of roses, dared not touch what they conceived were trees budding with fire, and the natives of Virginia, the first time they seized on a quantity of gunpowder which belonged to the English colony, sowed it for grain, expecting to reap a plentiful crop of combustion by the next harvest, to blow away the whole colony. In our own recollection, strange imaginations impeded the first period of vaccination, when some families, terrified by the warning of a physician, conceived their race would end in a species of minotaurs. Semi bovumque virum, semi varumque bovum. We smile at the simplicity of the men of nature for their mistaken notions at the first introduction among them of exotic novelties. And yet, even in civilized Europe, how long a time those whose profession or whose reputation regulates public opinion are influenced by vulgar prejudices, often disguised under the imposing form of science, and when their ludicrous absurdities and obstinate prejudices enter into the matters of history, it is then we discover that they were only imposing on themselves and on others. It is hardly credible that on the first introduction of the Chinese leaf, which now affords our daily refreshment, or the American leaf, whose sedative fumes made it so long an universal favorite, or the Arabian berry, whose aroma exhilarates its European votaries, that the use of these harmless novelties should have spread consternation among the nations of Europe, and have been anathematized by the terrors and the fictions of some of the learned. Yet this seems to have happened. Patin, who wrote so furiously against the introduction of antimony, spread the same alarm at the use of tea, which he calls l'impertinente nouveauté du siècle. In Germany, Hahnemann considered tea dealers as immoral members of society, lying in wait for men's purses and lives, and Dr. Duncan, in his treatise on hot liquors, suspected that the virtues attributed to tea were merely to encourage the importation. Footnote: Dr. James, the translator of Pauli's treatise on tea, 1746, says, "According to the Chinese, tea produces an appetite after hunger and thirst are satisfied. Therefore, the drinking of it is to be abstained from." He concludes his treatise by saying, "As Hippocrates spared no pains to remove and root out the Athenian plague, so have I used the utmost of my endeavours to destroy the raging epidemical madness of importing tea into Europe from China." End of footnote. Many virulent pamphlets were published against the use of this shrub, from various motives. In 1670, a Dutch writer says it was ridiculed in Holland under the name of hay water. "The progress of this famous plant," says an ingenious writer, "has been something like the progress of truth, suspected at first, though very palatable to those who had courage to taste it, resisted as it encroached, abused as its popularity seemed to spread, and establishing its triumph at last in cheering the whole land, from the palace to the cottage, only by the slow and resistless efforts of time and its own virtues." The History of the Tea Shrub, by Dr. Lettsom, usually referred to on this subject, I consider little more than a plagiarism on Dr. Short's learned and curious dissertation on tea, 1730, quarto. Lettsom has superadded the solemn trifling of his moral and medical advice. These now common beverages are all of recent origin in Europe. Neither the ancients nor those of the Middle Ages tasted of this luxury. The first accounts we find of the use of this shrub are the casual notices of travellers, who seem to have tasted it, and sometimes not to have liked it. A Russian ambassador in 1639, who resided at the court of the Mogul, declined accepting a large present of tea for the Tsar, as it would only encumber him with a commodity for which he had no use. The appearance of a black water and an acrid taste seems not to have recommended it to the German Olearius in 1633. Dr. Short has recorded an anecdote of a stratagem of the Dutch in their second voyage to China, by which they at first obtained their tea without disbursing money. They carried from home great store of dried sage, and bartered it with the Chinese for tea, and received 3 or 4 pounds of tea for 1 of sage. But at length the Dutch could not export sufficient quantities of sage to supply their demand. This fact, however, proves how deeply the imagination is concerned with our palate, for the Chinese, affected by the exotic novelty, considered our sage to be more precious than their tea. The first introduction of tea into Europe is not ascertained. According to the common accounts, it came into England from Holland in 1666, when Lord Arlington and Lord Ossory brought over a small quantity. The custom of drinking tea became fashionable, and a pound weight sold then for 60 shillings. This account, however, is by no means satisfactory. I have heard of Oliver Cromwell's teapot in the possession of a collector, and this will derange the chronology of those writers who are perpetually copying the researches of others, without confirming or correcting them. Footnote: modern collectors have gone beyond this, and exhibited Elizabethan teapots, which are just as likely to be true. There is no clear proof of the use of tea in England before the middle of the 17th century. This antedating of curiosities is the weakness of collectors. End of footnote. Amidst the rival contests of the Dutch and the English East India Companies, the honour of introducing its use into Europe may be claimed by both. Dr. Short conjectures that tea might have been known in England as far back as the reign of James I, for the first fleet set out in 1600, but had the use of the shrub been known, the novelty had been chronicled among our dramatic writers, whose works are the annals of our prevalent tastes and humours. It is rather extraordinary that our East India Company should not have discovered the use of this shrub in their early adventures. Yet it certainly was not known in England so late as in 1641, for in a scarce treatise of warm beer, where the title indicates the author's design to recommend hot in preference to cold drinks, he refers to tea only by quoting the Jesuit Maffei's account that "they of China do for the most part drink the strained liquor of an herb called chia, hot." The word cha is the Portuguese term for tea retained to this day, which they borrowed from the Japanese, while our intercourse with the Chinese made us no doubt adopt their term tea, now prevalent throughout Europe, with the exception of the Portuguese. The Chinese origin is still preserved in the term bohea, tea which comes from the country of Wui, and that of Hyson was the name of the most considerable Chinese then concerned in the trade. The best account of the early use and the prices of tea in England appears in the handbill of one who may be called our first tea maker. This curious handbill bears no date, but as Hanway ascertained that the price was 60 shillings in 1660, his bill must have been disbursed about that period. Thomas Garway, in Exchange Alley, tobacconist and coffee man, was the first who sold and retailed tea, recommending it for the cure of all disorders. The following shop bill is more curious than any historical account we have. Tea in England hath been sold in the leaf for £6, and sometimes for £10, the pound weight, and in respect of its former scarceness and dearness, it has been only used as a regalia in high treatments and entertainments, and presents made thereof to princes and grandees, till the year 1657. The said Garway did purchase a quantity thereof, and first publicly sold the said tea in leaf or drink, made according to the directions of the most knowing merchants into those eastern countries. On the knowledge of the said Garway's continued care and industry in obtaining the best tea, and making drink thereof, very many noblemen, physicians, merchants, etc., have ever since sent to him for the said leaf, and daily resort to his house to drink the drink thereof. He sells tea from 16s. to 50s. a pound. Probably tea was not in general use domestically so late as in 1687, for in the diary of Henry, Earl of Clarendon, he registers that Père Couplet supped with me, and after supper we had tea, which he said was really as good as any he had drank in China. Had his lordship been in the general habit of drinking tea, he had not probably made it a subject for his diary. While the honour of introducing tea may be disputed between the English and the Dutch, that of coffee remains between the English and the French. Yet an Italian intended to have occupied the place of honour. That admirable traveller Pietro della Valle, writing from Constantinople 1615 to a Roman, his fellow countryman, informing him that he should teach Europe in what manner the Turks took what he calls kahoué, or, as the word is written in an Arabic and English pamphlet printed at Oxford in 1659, on the nature of the drink kawi, or coffee. As this celebrated traveller lived to 1652, it may excite surprise that the first cup of coffee was not drank at Rome. This remains for the discovery of some member of the Arcadian Society. Our own Sandys, at the time that Val wrote, was also a traveller, and well knew what was kaffa, which they drink as hot as they can endure it. It is as black as soot, and tastes not much unlike it. Good, they say, for digestion and mirth. It appears by Legrand's Vie privée de François that the celebrated Thevenot in 1658 gave coffee after dinner, but it was considered as the whim of a traveller. Neither the thing itself nor its appearance was inviting. It was probably attributed by the Gay to the humour of a vain philosophical traveller. But 10 years afterwards a Turkish ambassador at Paris made the beverage highly fashionable. The elegance of the equipage recommended it to the eye, and charmed the women. The brilliant porcelain cups in which it was poured, the napkins fringed with gold, and the Turkish slaves on their knees presenting it to the ladies seated on the ground on cushions, turned the heads of the Parisian dames. This elegant introduction made the exotic beverage a subject of conversation, and in 1672 an Armenian at Paris at the fair time opened a coffee house. But the custom still prevailed to sell beer and wine, and to smoke and mix with indifferent company in their first imperfect coffee houses. A Florentine, one Procope, celebrated in his days as the arbiter of taste in this department, instructed by the error of the Armenian, invented a superior establishment, and introduced ices. He embellished his apartment, and those who had avoided the offensive coffee houses repaired to Procope's, where literary men, artists, and wits resorted to inhale the fresh and fragrant steam. Legrand says that this establishment holds a distinguished place in the literary history of the times. It was at the coffee house of Du Laurent that Saurin, Lamotte, Danchet, Boindin, Rousseau, etc., met. but the mild streams of the aromatic berry could not mollify the acerbity of so many rivals, and the witty malignity of Rousseau gave birth to those famous couplets on all the coffee drinkers, which occasioned his misfortune and his banishment. Such is the history of the first use of coffee and its houses at Paris. We, however, had the use before even the time of Thevenot, for an English-Turkish merchant brought a Greek servant in 1652, who, knowing how to roast and make it, opened a house to sell it publicly. I have also discovered his handbill, in which he sets forth the virtue of the coffee drink, first publicly made and sold in England by Pasqua Rossi in St. Michael's Alley, Cornhill, at the sign of his own head. Footnote: Aubrey, speaking of this house, then in other hands, says that Bowman's Coffee House in St. Michael's Alley, established 1652, was the first opened in London. About 4 years afterwards, James Farr, a barber, opened another in Fleet Street, by the Inner Temple Gate. Hatton, in his New View of London, 1708, says it is "now the Rainbow," and he narrates how Farr was presented by the inquest of St. Dunstan's in the West for making and selling a sort of liquor called coffee, as a great nuisance and prejudice to the neighbourhood. The words of the presentment are that, in making the same, he annoyeth his neighbours by evil smells. Hatton adds, with naivety, who would then have thought London would ever have had near 3,000 such nuisances, and that coffee would have been, as now, so much drank by the best of quality and physicians? It is, however, proper to note that coffee houses had been opened in Oxford at an earlier date. Anthony Wood informs us that one Jacob, a Jew, opened a coffee house in the parish of St. Peter in the East, at Oxford, as early as 1650. End of footnote. For about 20 years after the introduction of coffee in this kingdom, we find a continued series of invectives against its adoption, both for medicinal and domestic purposes. The use of coffee, indeed, seems to have excited more notice and to have had a greater influence on the manners of the people than that of tea. It seems at first to have been more universally used, as it still is on the continent, and its use is connected with a resort for the idle and the curious. The history of coffee houses, ere the invention of clubs, was that of the manners, the morals, and the politics of a people. Even in its native country the government discovered that extraordinary fact, and the use of the Arabian berry was more than once forbidden where it grows. For Ellis, in his History of Coffee, 1774, refers to an Arabian manuscript in the King of France's library, which shows that coffee houses in Asia were sometimes suppressed. The same fate happened on its introduction into England. Among a number of poetical satires against the use of coffee, I find a curious exhibition according to the exaggerated notions of that day, in A Cup of Coffee, or Coffee in its Colours, 1663. The writer, like others of his contemporaries, wonders at the odd taste which could make coffee a substitute for canary. For men and Christians to turn Turks and think to excuse the crime, because 'tis in their drink. Pure English apes ye may, for aught I know. Would it but mode, learn to eat spiders too. Footnote: This witty poet was not without a degree of prescience. The luxury of eating spiders has never indeed become modish, but Monsieur Lalande, the French astronomer, and one or two humble imitators of the modern philosopher, have shown this triumph over vulgar prejudices, and were epicures of this stamp. End of footnote. Should any of your grandsire's ghosts appear in your wax candle circles, and but hear the name of coffee so much called upon, then see it drank like scalding phlegethon, would they not startle, think ye all agreed 'twas conjuration both in word and deed, or Catalan's conspirators as they stood, sealing their oaths in draughts of blackest blood? The merriest ghost of all your sires would say, your wine's much worse since his last yesterday. He'd wonder how the club had given a hop, or tavern bars into a farrier's shop, where he'd suppose, both by the smoke and stench, each man a horse, and each horse at his drench. Sure you're no poets, nor their friends for now, should Johnson's strenuous spirit, or the rare Beaumont and Fletcher's in your round appear, they would not find the air perfumed with one Castalian drop, nor dew of Helicon. When they but men would speak as the gods do, they drank pure nectar as the gods drink too, sublimed with rich canary. Say, shall then these less than coffee self, these coffee men, these sons of nothing that can hardly make their broth for laughing how the jest does take, yet grin and give ye for the vine's pure blood a loathsome potion not yet understood, syrup of soot, or essence of old shoes, dashed with diurnals and the books of news? Other complaints arose from the mixture of the company in the first coffee houses. In A Broadside Against Coffee, or The Marriage of the Turk, 1672, the writer indicates the growth of the fashion. Confusion huddles all into one scene, like Noah's Ark, the clean and the unclean. For now, alas, the drench has credit got, and he's no gentleman who drinks it not. That such a dwarf should rise to such a stature, but custom is but a remove from nature. In The Women's Petition against Coffee, 1674, they complained that it made men as unfruitful as the deserts whence that unhappy berry is said to be brought, that the offspring of our mighty ancestors would dwindle into a succession of apes and pygmies, and on a domestic message a husband would stop by the way to drink a couple of cups of coffee. It was now sold in convenient pennyworths, for in another poem, in praise of a coffee house, for the variety of information obtained there, it is called a penny university. Amidst these contests of popular prejudices between the lovers of forsaken Canary and the terrors of our females at the barrenness of an Arabian desert, which lasted for 20 years, at length the custom was universally established, nor were there wanting some reflecting minds desirous of introducing the use of this liquid among the labouring classes of society to wean them from strong liquors. Howell, in noticing that curious philosophical traveller, Sir Henry Blount's Organon Salutis, 1659, observed that this coffa drink hath caused a great sobriety among all nations. Formerly apprentices, clerks, etc., used to take their morning draughts in ale, beer, or wine, which often made them unfit for business. Now they play the good fellows in this wakeful and civil drink. The worthy gentleman, Sir James Mudderford, who introduced the practice hereof first in London, deserves much respect of the whole nation. Here it appears what is most probable, that the use of this berry was introduced by other Turkish merchants, besides Edwards and his servant Pasqua. But the custom of drinking coffee among the labouring classes does not appear to have lasted, and when it was recently even the cheapest beverage, the popular prejudices prevailed against it, and ran in favour of tea. The contrary practice prevails on the continent, where beggars are viewed making their coffee in the street. I remember seeing the large body of shipwrights at Helvoetsluys summoned by a bell to take their regular refreshment of coffee, and the fleets of Holland were not then built by arms less robust than the fleets of Britain. The frequenting of coffee houses is a custom which has declined within our recollection since institutions of a higher character, and society itself, have so much improved within late years. These were, however, the common assemblies of all classes of society. The mercantile man, the man of letters, and the man of fashion had their appropriate coffee houses. The Tatler dates from either to convey a character of his subject. In the reign of Charles II, 1675, a proclamation for some time shut them all up, having become the rendezvous of the politicians of that day. Roger North has given, in his Examen, a full account of this bold stroke. It was not done without some apparent respect to the British Constitution, the court affecting not to act against law, for the judges were summoned to a consultation when, it seems, the 5 who met did not agree in opinion. But a decision was contrived that the retailing of coffee and tea might be an innocent trade, but as it was said to nourish sedition, spread lies, and scandalize great men, it might also be a common nuisance. A general discontent, in consequence, as North acknowledges, took place, and emboldened the merchants and retailers of coffee and tea to petition, and permission was soon granted to open the houses to a certain period, under a severe admonition that the masters should prevent all scandalous papers, books, and libels from being read in them, and hinder every person from spreading scandalous reports against the government. It must be confessed, all this must have frequently puzzled the coffee-house master to decide what was scandalous, what book was fit to be licensed to be read, and what political intelligence might be allowed to be communicated. The object of the government was, probably, to intimidate rather than to persecute at that moment. Chocolate the Spaniards brought from Mexico, where it was denominated chocolate. It was a coarse mixture of ground cacao and Indian corn with roku, but the Spaniards, liking its nourishment, improved it into a richer compound, with sugar, vanilla, and other aromatics. The immoderate use of chocolate in the 17th century was considered as so violent an inflamer of the passions that Juan Fran Rauch published a treatise against it, and enforced the necessity of forbidding the monks to drink it, and adds that if such an interdiction had existed, that scandal with which that holy order had been branded might have proved more groundless. This Disputatio Medico Dietetica de Are et Esculentus Necnon de Potu, Vienna, 1624, is a rara avis among collectors. This attack on the monks, as well as on chocolate, is said to be the cause of its scarcity, for we are told that they were so diligent in suppressing this treatise that it is supposed not a dozen copies exist. We had chocolate houses in London long after coffee houses. They seemed to have associated something more elegant and refined in their new term when the other had become common. Footnote: not only tea, which we have from the East, but also chocolate, which is imported from the West Indies, begins to be famous. Dr. James's Treatise on Tobacco, Tea, Coffee, and Chocolate, 1746. End of footnote. Roger North thus inveighs against them. The use of coffee houses seems much improved by a new invention, called chocolate houses, for the benefit of rooks and coolies of quality, where gaming is added to all the rest, and the summons of W. seldom fails, as if the devil had erected a new university, and those were the colleges of its professors, as well as his schools of discipline. Roger North, a high Tory and Attorney General to James II, observed, however, these rendezvous were often not entirely composed of those factious gentry he so much dreaded, for he says, this way of passing time might have been stopped at first, before people had possessed themselves of some convenience from them of meeting for short despatches, and passing evenings with small expenses. And old Aubrey, the small Boswell of his day, attributes his general acquaintance to the modern advantage of coffee houses in this great city, before which men knew not how to be acquainted but with their own relations and societies. A curious statement, which proves the moral connection with society of all sedentary recreations which induce the herding spirit. End of section 55.
Section 56 of Curiosities of Literature, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Curiosities of Literature, Volume 2, by Isaac Disraeli. Charles I's Love of the Fine Arts. Herbert, the faithful attendant of Charles I during the 2 last years of the king's life, mentions a diamond seal with the king's arms engraved on it. The history of this diamond seal is remarkable, and seems to have been recovered by the conjectural sagacity of Warburton, who never exercised his favourite talent with greater felicity. The curious passage I transcribe may be found in a manuscript letter to Dr. Burt. If you have read Herbert's account of the last days of Charles I's life, you must remember he tells a story of a diamond seal, with the arms of England cut into it. This King Charles ordered to be given, I think, to the prince. I suppose you don't know what became of this seal, but would be surprised to find it afterwards in the court of Persia. Yet there Tavernier certainly carried it, and offered it for sale, as I certainly collect from these words of Volume 1, page 541, Mais souvenant de ce qui est arrivé au Chevalier de Réville, etc. He tells us he told the prime minister what was engraved on the diamond was the arms of a prince of Europe, but, says he, I would not be more particular, remembering the case of Réville. Réville's case was this: he came to seek employment under the Sophie, who asked him where he had served. He said in England under Charles I, and that he was a captain in his guards. Why did you leave his service? He was murdered by cruel rebels. And how had you the impudence, says the Sophie, to survive him? And so disgraced him. Now Tavernier was afraid if he had said the arms of England had been on the seal, that they would have occasioned the inquiry into the old story. You will ask how Tavernier got this seal. I suppose that the prince, in his necessities, sold it to Tavernier, who was at Paris when the English court was there. What made me recollect Herbert's account on reading this was the singularity of an impress cut on the diamond, which Tavernier represents as a most extraordinary rarity. Charles I was a great virtuoso, and delighted particularly in sculpture and painting. This is an instance of conjectural evidence, where an historical fact seems established on no other authority than the ingenuity of a student, exercised in his library on a private and secret event, a century after it had occurred. The diamond seal of Charles I may yet be discovered in the treasures of the Persian sovereign. Warburton, who had ranged with keen delight through the age of Charles I, the noblest and the most humiliating in our own history, and in that of the world, perpetually instructive, has justly observed the king's passion for the fine arts. It was indeed such, that had the reign of Charles I proved prosperous, that sovereign, about 1640, would have anticipated those tastes, and even that enthusiasm, which are still almost foreign to the nation. The mind of Charles I was moulded by the Graces. His favourite Buckingham was probably a greater favourite for those congenial tastes, and the frequent exhibition of those splendid masques and entertainments, which combined all the picture of ballet dances with the voice of music, the charms of the verse of Johnson, the scenic machinery of Inigo Jones, and the variety of fanciful devices of Gerbier, the Duke's architect, the bosom friend of Rubens. Gerbier was in Antwerp at Rubens' death, and sent over an inventory of his pictures and effects for the king's selection. End of footnote. There was a costly magnificence in the fête at York House, the residence of Buckingham, of which few but curious researchers are aware. They eclipsed the splendour of the French court, for Bassompierre, in one of his dispatches, declares he had never witnessed a similar magnificence. He describes the vaulted apartments, the ballets at supper, which were proceeding between the services, with various representations, theatrical changes, and those of the tables and the music. The Duke's own contrivance to prevent the inconvenience of pressure, by having a turning door made like that of the monasteries, which admitted only one person at a time. The following extract from a manuscript letter of the time conveys a lively account of one of those fêtes. Last Sunday at night the Duke's Grace entertained their Majesties and the French ambassador at York House with great feasting and show, where all things came down in clouds, amongst which one rare device was a representation of the French king and the two queens with their chiefest attendants, and so to the life that the Queen's Majesty could name them. It was 4 o'clock in the morning before they parted, and then the king and queen, together with the French ambassador, lodged there. Some estimate this entertainment at 5,000 or 6,000 pounds. At another time the king and queen were entertained at supper at Gerbier, the duke's painter's house, which could not stand him in less than 1,000 pounds. Sir Symonds D'Ewes mentions banquets at 500 pounds. The fullest account I have found of one of these entertainments, which at once show the curiosity of the scenical machinery and the fancy of the poet, the richness of the crimson habits of the gentlemen, and the white dresses with white heron's plumes and jewelled head dresses and ropes of pearls of the ladies, was in a manuscript letter of the times with which I supplied the editor of Johnson, who has preserved the narrative in his memoirs of that poet. Such were the magnificent entertainments, says Mr. Gifford, which, though modern refinement may affect to despise them, modern splendour never reached, even in thought. That the expenditure was costly proves that the greater encouragement was offered to artists, nor should Buckingham be censured, as some will incline to, for this lavish expense. It was not unusual for the great nobility then; for the literary Duchess of Newcastle mentions that an entertainment of this sort, which the Duke gave to Charles the First, cost her lord between 4,000 and 5,000 pounds. The ascetic Puritan would indeed abhor these scenes, but their magnificence was also designed to infuse into the national character gentler feelings and more elegant tastes. They charmed even the fiercer republican spirits in their tender youth. Milton owes his Arcades and his delightful Comus to a masque at Ludlow Castle; and Whitelocke, who was himself an actor and manager in a splendid royal masque of the four Inns of Courts joined together, to go to court about the time that Prynne published his Histriomastics, to manifest the difference of their opinions from Mr. Prynne's new learning, seems even at a later day, when drawing up his memorials of the English affairs and occupied by graver concerns, to have dwelt with all the fondness of reminiscence on the stately shows and masques of his more innocent age, and has devoted, in a chronicle which contracts many an important event into a single paragraph, 6 folio columns to a minute, and very curious description of these dreams past and these vanished pomps. Charles the First, indeed, not only possessed a critical tact, but extensive knowledge in the fine arts and the relics of antiquity. In his flight in 1642, the king stopped at the abode of the religious family of the Ferrars at Gidding, who had there raised a singular monastic institution among themselves. One of their favourite amusements had been to form an illustrated Bible, the wonder and the talk of the country. In turning it over, the king would tell his companion, the Palsgrave, whose curiosity in prints exceeded his knowledge, the various masters and the character of their inventions. When Panzani, a secret agent of the Pope, was sent over to England to promote the Catholic cause, the subtle and elegant Catholic Barberini, called the protector of the English at Rome, introduced Panzini to the king's favour by making him appear an agent rather for procuring him fine pictures, statues, and curiosities; and the earnest inquiries and orders given by Charles the First prove his perfect knowledge of the most beautiful existing remains of ancient art. The statues go on prosperously, says Cardinal Barberini in a letter to a Mazarin, nor shall I hesitate to rob Rome of her most valuable ornaments, if in exchange we might be so happy as to have the King of England's name among those princes who submit to the apostolic see. Charles the First was particularly urgent to procure a statue of Adonis in the Villa Ludovicia. Every effort was made by the queen's confessor, Father Philips, and the vigilant cardinal at Rome, but the inexorable Duchess of Fiano would not suffer it to be separated from her rich collection of statues and paintings, even for the chance conversion of a whole kingdom of heretics. Footnote: see Gregorio Panzani's Memoirs of his agency in England. This work long lay in manuscript, and was only known to us in the Catholic Dodd's Church History by partial extracts. It was at length translated from the Italian manuscript, and published by the Rev. Joseph Barrington, a curious piece of our own secret history. End of footnote. This monarch, who possessed 24 palaces, all of them elegantly and completely furnished, had formed very considerable collections. The value of pictures had doubled in Europe by the emulation between our Charles and Philip the Fourth of Spain, who was touched with the same elegant passion. When the rulers of fanaticism began their reign, all the king's furniture was put to sale. His pictures, disposed of at very low prices, enriched all the collections in Europe. The cartoons, when complete, were only appraised at £300, though the whole collection of the king's curiosities were sold at above £50,000. Hume adds, the very library medals of St. James's were intended by the generals to be brought to auction, in order to pay the arrears of some regiments of cavalry; but Selden, apprehensive of this loss, engaged his friend Whitelocke, then Lord Keeper of the Commonwealth, to apply for the office of librarian. This contrivance saved that valuable collection. This account is only partly correct. The love of books, which formed the passion of the two learned scholars whom Hume notices, fortunately intervened to save the royal collection from the intended scattering. But the pictures and medals were perhaps objects too slight in the eyes of the book learned. They were resigned to the singular fate of appraisement. After the Restoration very many books were missing, but scarcely a third part of the medals remained. Of the strange manner in which these precious remains of ancient art and history were valued and disposed of, the following account may not be read without interest. In March 1648, the Parliament ordered commissioners to be appointed to inventory the goods and personal estate of the late king, queen, and prince, and appraise them for the use of the public; and in April 1648 an act, adds Whitelocke, was committed for inventorying the late king's goods, etc. This very inventory I have examined. It forms a magnificent folio of near 1,000 pages, of an extraordinary dimension, bound in crimson velvet and richly gilt. written in a fair large hand, but with little knowledge of the objects which the inventory writer describes. It is entitled An Inventory of the Goods, Jewels, Plate, etc., belonging to King Charles I., sold by order of the Council of State from the year 1619 to 1652, so that from the decapitation of the king a year was allowed to draw up the inventory, and the sale proceeded during 3 years. From this manuscript catalogue, to give long extracts were useless. It has afforded, however, some remarkable observations. Every article was appraised, nothing was sold under the affixed price, but a slight competition sometimes seems to have raised the sum. And when the Council of State could not get the sum appraised, the gold and silver were sent to the mint, and assuredly many fine works of art were valued by the ounce. The names of the purchasers appear. They are usually English, but probably many were the agents for foreign courts. The coins or medals were thrown promiscuously into drawers. One drawer, having 24 medals, was valued at £2 10s. Another of 20 at £1, another of 24 at £1, and one drawer containing 46 silver coins with the box was sold for £5. On the whole, the medals seem not to have been valued at much more than a shilling apiece. The appraiser was certainly no antiquary. The king's curiosities in the Tower jewel house generally fetched above the price fixed. The toys of art could please the unlettered minds that had no conception of its works. The Temple of Jerusalem, made of ebony and amber, fetched £25. A fountain of silver for perfumed waters, artificially made to play of itself, sold for £30. A chessboard, said to be Queen Elizabeth's, inlaid with gold, silver, and pearls, £23. A conjuring drum from Lapland, with an almanac cut on a piece of wood. Several sections in silver of a Turkish galley, a Venetian gondola, an Indian canoe, and a first-rate man-of-war. A Saxon king's mace, used in war, with a ball full of spikes, and the handle covered with gold plates and enamelled, sold for £37 8s. A gorget of massy gold, chased with the manner of a battle, weighing 31 ounces, at £3 10s. per ounce, was sent to the mint. A Roman shield of buff leather, covered with a plate of gold, finely chased with a gorgon's head, set round the rim with rubies, emeralds, turquoise stones, in number 137, £132 12s. The pictures, taken from Whitehall, Windsor, Wimbledon, Greenwich, Hampton Court, etc., exhibit in number an unparalleled collection. By what standard they were valued it would perhaps be difficult to conjecture. From £50 to £100 seems to have been the limits of the appraiser's taste and imagination. Some whose price is whimsically low may have been thus rated from a political feeling respecting the portrait of the person. There are, however, in this singular appraised catalogue 2 pictures, which were rated at and sold for the remarkable sums of £1,000 and of £2,000. The one was a sleeping Venus by Correggio, and the other a Madonna by Raphael. There was also a picture by Giulio Romano called The Great Piece of the Nativity at £500, the Little Madonna and Christ by Raphael at £800, the Great Venus and Parde by Titian at £600. These seem to have been the only pictures in this immense collection which reached a picture's prices. The inventory writer had probably been instructed by the public voice of their value, which, however, would in the present day be considered much under a fourth. Rubens' Woman taken in Adultery, described as a large picture, sold for £20, and his Peace and Plenty, with many figures big as the life, for £100. Titian's pictures seem generally valued at £100. One of these pictures, a concert, is now in our National Gallery. Venus, dressed by the Graces, by Guido, reached to £200. The cartoons of Raphael, here called the Acts of the Apostles, notwithstanding their subject was so congenial to the popular feelings, and only appraised at £300, could find no purchaser. They were secured by Cromwell, who had intended to reproduce the designs at the tapestry factory established in Mortlake, but the troubles of the kingdom hindered it. Charles II very nearly sold them to France. Lord Danby intercepted the sale, when they were packed away in boxes, until the time of William III, who built the gallery at Hampton Court expressly for their exhibition. The following full lengths of celebrated personages were rated at these whimsical prices. Queen Elizabeth in her Parliament robes, valued £1. The Queen Mother in mourning habit, valued £3. Buchanan's picture, valued £3 10s. The King when a youth in coats, valued £2. The picture of the Queen when she was with child, sold for 5s. King Charles on horseback, by Sir Anthony Van Dyck, was purchased by Sir Balthazar Gerbier at the appraised price of £200. This picture is now one of the ornaments of Windsor Castle. The greatest sums were produced by the tapestry and arras hangings, which were chiefly purchased for the service of the Protector. Their amount exceeds £30,000. I note a few. At Hampton Court, 10 pieces of arras hangings of Abraham, containing 826 yards, at £10 a yard, £8,260. 10 pieces of Julius Caesar, 717 ells, at £7, £5,019. These would appear to be copies of Andrea Mantegna's Triumphs of Julius Caesar, the cartoons of which are still in the galleries of Hampton Court. One of the cloth of estates is thus described: one rich cloth of estate of purple velvet, embroidered with gold, having the arms of England within a garter, with all the furniture suitable thereunto. The state containing these stones following: 2 cameos or agates, 12 chrysolites, 12 ballases or garnets, 1 sapphire seated in chases of gold, 1 long pearl pendant, and many large and small pearls, valued at £500, sold for £602 10s. to Mr. Oliver for February 1649. Was plain Mr. Oliver in 1649, who we see was one of the earlier purchasers, shortly after the Lord Protector. All the cloth of estate and arras hangings were afterwards purchased for the service of the Protector, and one may venture to conjecture that when Mr. Oliver purchased this rich cloth of estate, it was not without a latent motive of its service to the new owner. Some may be curious to learn the price of gold and silver about 1650. It appears by this manuscript inventory that the silver sold at 4s. 11d. per ounce, and gold at £3 10s., so that the value of these metals has little varied during the last century and a half. There is one circumstance remarkable in the feeling of Charles I for the fine arts. It was a passion without ostentation or egotism, for although this monarch was inclined himself to participate in the pleasures of a creating artist, the king having handled the pencil and composed a poem, yet he never suffered his private dispositions to prevail over his more majestic duties. We do not discover in history that Charles I was a painter and a poet. Accident and secret history only reveal this softening feature in his grave and king-like character. Charles sought no glory from, but only indulged his love for art and the artists. There are 3 manuscripts on his art by Leonardo da Vinci in the Ambrosian Library, which bear an inscription that a king of England in 1639 offered 1,000 guineas of gold for each. Charles, too, suggested to the 2 great painters of his age the subjects he considered worthy of their pencils, and had for his closet companions those native poets for which he was censured in evil times, and even by Milton. In his imprisonment at Carisbrooke Castle, the author of the Icon Basilike solaced his royal woes by composing a poem entitled, in the very style of this memorable volume, Majesty in Misery, or an Imploration to the King of Kings, a title probably not his own, but like that volume, it contains stanzas fraught with the most tender and solemn feeling. Such a subject in the hands of such an author was sure to produce poetry, although in the unpractised poet we may want the versifier. A few stanzas will illustrate this conception of part of his character. The fiercest furies that do daily tread upon my grief, my grey discrowned head, are those that own my bounty for their bread. With my own power my majesty they wound in the king's name, the king himself uncrowned. So doth the dust destroy the diamond. After a pathetic description of his queen, forced in pilgrimage to seek a tomb, and Great Britain's heir forced into France, where, poor child, he weeps out his inheritance, Charles continues: They promise to erect my royal stem, to make me great, to advance my diadem, if I will first fall down and worship them. But for refusal they devour my thrones, distress my children, and destroy my bones. I fear they'll force me to make bread of stones. And implores with a martyr's piety the Saviour's forgiveness for those who were more misled than criminal. Such as thou knowest do not know what they do. Footnote. This poem is omitted in the great edition of the King's Works, published after the Restoration, and was given by Burnet from a manuscript of his Memoirs of the Dukes of Hamilton, but it had been previously published in Perenchief's Life of Charles I. It has been suspected that this poem is a pious fraud, and put forth in the king's name, as likewise was the Icon Basilike. One point I have since ascertained is, that Charles did write verses as rugged as some of these, and in respect to the book, notwithstanding the artifice and the interpolations of Gauden, I believe that there are some passages which Charles only could have written. End of footnote. As a poet and a painter, Charles is not popularly known, but this article was due to preserve the memory of the royal votary's ardour and pure feelings for the love of the fine arts. Footnote. This article was composed without any recollection that a part of the subject had been anticipated by Lord Orford. In the anecdotes of painting in England, many curious particulars are noticed. The story of the king's diamond seal had reached his lordship, and Vertue had a mutilated transcript of the inventory of the king's pictures, etc., discovered in Moorfields, for, among others, more than 30 pages at the beginning relating to the plate and jewels were missing. The manuscript in the Harleian collection is perfect. Lord Orford has also given an interesting anecdote to show the king's discernment in the knowledge of the hands of the painters, which confirms the little anecdote I have related from the Ferrars. But for a more intimate knowledge of this monarch's intercourse with artists, I beg to refer to the 3rd volume of my Commentaries on the Life and Reign of Charles I, chapter the 6th, on the private life of Charles I, love of the arts. End of footnote. End of section 56.
Section 57 of Curiosities of Literature, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. Curiosities of Literature, Volume 2 by Isaac Disraeli. Secret History of Charles I and his Queen, Henrietta. The secret history of Charles I and his Queen, Henrietta of France, opens a different scene from the one exhibited in the passionate drama of our history. The king is accused of the most spiritless uxoriousness, and the chaste fondness of a husband is placed among his political errors. Even Hume conceives that his queen precipitated him into hasty and imprudent counsels, and Bishop Kennet had alluded to the influence of a stately queen over an affectionate husband. The uxoriousness of Charles is re-echoed by all the writers of a certain party. This is an odium which the king's enemies first threw out to make him contemptible, while his apologists imagined that, in perpetuating this accusation, they had discovered, in a weakness which has at least something amiable, some palliation for his own political misconduct. The factious, too, by this aspersion, promoted the alarm they spread in the nation of the king's inclination to popery. Yet, on the contrary, Charles was then making a determined stand, and at length triumphed over a Catholic faction which was ruling his queen, and this at the risk and menace of a war with France. Yet this firmness too has been denied him, even by his apologist Hume. That historian, on his preconceived system, imagined that every action of Charles originated in the Duke of Buckingham, and that the Duke pursued his personal quarrel with Richelieu, and taking advantage of these domestic quarrels, had persuaded Charles to dismiss the French attendants of the Queen. Footnote: Hume, Volume 6, page 234. Charles seems, however, to have constantly consulted his favourite minister, the Duke of Buckingham, on the subject, though his letters express clearly his own determination. In Harleian manuscripts 6988 is a letter written to Buckingham, dated Hampton Court, 20th November, 1625. He declares, "I thought I would have cause enough in short time to put away the Monsieurs, from the quarrels they would ferment between himself and his wife or his subjects, and begs of him to acquaint the Queen Mother, Mary de Medicis, with my intention, for this being an action that may have a show of harshness, I thought it was fit to take this way, that she to whom I have had many obligations may not take it unkindly." In another long letter, preserved among the Rawlinson manuscripts in the Bodleian Library, he enters minutely into his domestic grievances. "What unkindnesses and distastes have fallen between my wife and me," which he attributes to the crafty counsels of her servants. On 7th August 1626 he writes a final letter to the Duke, ordering him to send them all away, "if you can, by fair means, but stick not long in disputing; otherwise force them away, driving them away like so many wild beasts until ye have shipped them, and so the devil go with them." End of footnote. There are, fortunately, 2 letters from Charles I to Buckingham, preserved in the State Papers of Lord Hardwicke, which set this point at rest. These decisively prove that the whole matter originated with the king himself, and that Buckingham had tried every effort to persuade him to the contrary. for the king complains that he had been too long overcome by his persuasions, but that he was now resolved it must be done, and that shortly. It is remarkable that the character of a queen, who is imagined to have performed so active a part in our history, scarcely ever appears in it. When abroad, and when she returned to England in the midst of a winter storm, bringing all the aid she could to her unfortunate consort, those who witnessed this appearance of energy imagined that her character was equally powerful in the cabinet. Yet Henrietta, after all, was nothing more than a volatile woman, one who had never studied, never reflected, and whom nature had formed to be charming and haughty, but whose vivacity could not retain even a state secret for an hour, and whose talents were quite opposite to those of deep political intrigue. Henrietta viewed even the characters of great men with all the sensations of a woman. Describing the Earl of Strafford to a confidential friend, and having observed that he was a great man, she dwelt with far more interest on his person. "Though not handsome," said she, "he was agreeable enough, and he had the finest hands of any man in the world." Landing at Burlington Bay, in Yorkshire, she lodged on the quay. The Parliament's admiral barbarously pointed his cannon at the house, and several shots reaching it, her favourite, German, requested her to fly. She safely reached a cavern in the fields, but recollecting that she had left a lap dog asleep in its bed, she flew back, and amidst the cannon shot returned with this other favourite. The Queen related this incident of the lap dog to her friend Madame Motteville. These ladies considered it as a complete woman's victory. It is in these memoirs we find that when Charles went down to the House to seize on the 5 leading members of the opposition, the Queen could not restrain her lively temper, and impatiently babbled the plot, so that one of the ladies in attendance dispatched a hasty note to the parties, who, as the king entered the house, had just time to leave it. Some have dated the ruin of his cause to the failure of that impolitic step which alarmed every one zealous for that spirit of political freedom which had now grown up in the Commons. Incidents like these mark the feminine dispositions of Henrietta. But when at sea, in danger of being taken by a parliamentarian, the Queen commanded the captain not to strike, but to prepare at the extremity to blow up the ship, resisting the shrieks of her females and domestics. We perceive how, on every trying occasion, Henrietta never forgot that she was the daughter of Henry IV. That glorious affinity was inherited by her with all the sexual pride, and hence, at times, that energy in her actions which was so far above her intellectual capacity. And indeed, when the awful events she had witnessed were one by one registered in her melancholy mind, the sensibility of the woman subdued the natural haughtiness of her character. But, true woman, the feeling creature of circumstances, at the Restoration she resumed it, and when the new court of Charles II would not endure her obsolete haughtiness, the Dowager Queen left it in all the full bitterness of her spirit. An habitual gloom and the meagreness of grief during the Commonwealth had changed a countenance once the most lively, and her eyes, whose dark and dazzling lustre was ever celebrated, then only shone in tears. When she told her physician, Sir Theodore Mayerne, that she found her understanding was failing her, and seemed terrified lest it was approaching to madness, the court physician, hardly courtly to fallen majesty, replied, "Madam, fear not that, for you are already mad." Henrietta had lived to contemplate the awful changes of her reign without comprehending them. Waller, in the profusion of poetical decoration, makes Henrietta so beautiful that her beauty would affect every lover more than his private loves. She was the whole world's mistress. A portrait in crayons of Henrietta at Hampton Court sadly reduces all his poetry, for the miraculous was only in the fancy of the court poet. But there may be some truth in what he says of the eyes of Henrietta. Such eyes as yours on Jove himself had thrown as bright and fierce a lightning as his own. And in another poem there is one characteristic line: such radiant eyes, such lovely motion, and such sharp replies. In a manuscript letter of the times, the writer describes the queen as nimble and quick, black-eyed, brown-haired, and a brave lady. In the manuscript journal of Sir Symonds D'Ewes, who saw the queen on her first arrival in London, cold and puritanic as was that antiquary, he notices with some warmth the features of her face, which were much enlivened by her radiant and sparkling black eye. She appears to have possessed French vivacity both in her manners and her conversation. In the history of a queen, an accurate conception of her person enters for something. Her talents were not of that order which could influence the revolutions of a people. Her natural dispositions might have allowed her to become a politician of the toilet, and she might have practised those slighter artifices which may be considered as so many political coquetries; but Machiavellian principles and involved intrigues, of which she has been so freely accused, could never have entered into her character. At first she tried all the fertile inventions of a woman to persuade the king that she was his humblest creature, and the good people of England that she was quite in love with them. Now that we know that no female was ever more deeply tainted with Catholic bigotry, and that, haughty as she was, this princess suffered the most insulting superstitions inflicted as penances by her priests for this very marriage with a Protestant prince, the following new facts relating to her first arrival in England curiously contrast with the mortified feelings she must have endured by the violent suppression of her real ones. We must first bring forward a remarkable and unnoticed document in the embassies of Marshal Bassompierre. It is nothing less than a most solemn obligation contracted with the Pope and her brother, the King of France, to educate her children as Catholics, and only to choose Catholics to attend them. Had this been known either to Charles or to the English nation, Henrietta could never have been permitted to ascend the English throne. The fate of both her sons shows how faithfully she performed this treasonable contract. This piece of secret history opens the concealed cause of those deep impressions of that faith which both monarchs sucked in with their milk, that triumph of the cradle over the grave which most men experience. Charles II died a Catholic. James II lived as one. When Henrietta was on her way to England, a legate from Rome arrested her at Amiens, requiring the princess to undergo a penance which was to last 16 days for marrying Charles without the papal dispensation. The queen stopped her journey and wrote to inform the king of the occasion. Charles, who was then waiting for her at Canterbury, replied that if Henrietta did not instantly proceed, he would return alone to London. Henrietta doubtless sighed for the Pope and the penance, but she set off the day she received the king's letter. The king, either by his wisdom or his impatience, detected the aim of the Roman pontiff, who, had he been permitted to arrest the progress of a Queen of England for 16 days in the face of all Europe, would thus have obtained a tacit supremacy over a British monarch. When the king arrived at Canterbury, although not at the moment prepared to receive him, Henrietta flew to meet him, and with all her spontaneous grace and native vivacity, kneeling at his feet, she kissed his hand, while the king, bending over her, wrapped her in his arms and kissed her with many kisses. This royal and youthful pair, unusual with those of their rank, met with the eagerness of lovers, and the first words of Henrietta were those of devotion. Sire, je suis venu en ces pays de votre majesté pour être aisé et commandé de vous. It had been rumoured that she was of a very short stature, but reaching to the king's shoulder. His eyes were cast down to her feet, seemingly observing whether she used art to increase her height. Anticipating his thoughts, and playfully showing her feet, she declared that "she stood upon her own feet, for thus high I am, and neither higher nor lower." After an hour's conversation in privacy, Henrietta took her dinner surrounded by the court, and the king, who had already dined, performing the office of her carver, cut a pheasant and some venison. By the side of the queen stood her ghostly confessor, solemnly reminding her that this was the eve of John the Baptist, and was to be fasted, exhorting her to be cautious that she set no scandalous example on her first arrival. But Charles and his court were now to be gained over, as well as John the Baptist. She affected to eat very heartily of the forbidden meat, which gave great comfort, it seems, to several of her new heretical subjects then present, but we may conceive the pangs of so confirmed a devotee. She carried her dissimulation so far that being asked about this time whether she could abide a Huguenot, she replied, "Why not? Was not my father one?" Her ready smiles, the graceful wave of her hand, the many good signs of hope, as a contemporary in a manuscript letter expresses it, induced many of the English to believe that Henrietta might even become one of themselves. Sir Symonds D'Ewes, as appears by his manuscript diary, was struck by "her deportment to her women, and her looks to her servants, which were so sweet and humble." Footnote: Sir S. D'Ewes' Journal of his Life, Harleian manuscript 646. We have seen our Puritanic antiquary describing the person of the queen with some warmth, but he could not abstain from deep-fetched sighs to consider that she wanted the knowledge of true religion, a circumstance that Henrietta would have as zealously regretted for Sir Symonds himself. End of footnote. However, this was in the first days of her arrival, and these sweet and humble looks were not constant ones, for a courier at Whitehall, writing to a friend, observes that "the queen, however little of stature, yet is of a pleasing countenance, if she be pleased, otherwise full of spirit and vigour, and seems of more than ordinary resolution." And he adds an incident of one of her frowns. The room in which the queen was at dinner, being somewhat overheated with the fire and company, she drove us all out of the chamber. I suppose none but a queen could have cast such a scowl. We may already detect the fair waxen mask melting away on the features it covered, even in one short month. By the marriage contract, Henrietta was to be allowed a household establishment, composed of her own people, and this had been contrived to be not less than a small French colony exceeding 300 persons. It composed, in fact, a French faction, and looks like a covert project of Richelieu's to further his intrigues here, by opening a perpetual correspondence with the discontented Catholics of England. In the instructions of Bassompierre, one of the alleged objects of the marriage is the general good of the Catholic religion, by affording some relief to those English who professed it. If, however, that great statesman ever entertained this political design, the simplicity and pride of the Roman priests here completely overturned it, for in their blind zeal they dared to extend their domestic tyranny over majesty itself. The French party had not long resided here ere the mutual jealousies between the two nations broke out. All the English who were not Catholics were soon dismissed from their attendance on the Queen by herself, while Charles was compelled by the popular cry to forbid any English Catholics to serve the Queen or to be present at the celebration of her mass. The king was even obliged to employ pursuivants or king's messengers to stand at the door of her chapel to seize on any of the English who entered there, while on these occasions the French would draw their swords to defend these concealed Catholics. The Queen and hers became an odious distinction in the nation. Such were the indecent scenes exhibited in public. They were not less reserved in private. The following anecdote of saying a grace before the king at his own table in a most indecorous race run between the Catholic priest and the king's chaplain is given in a manuscript letter of the times. The king and queen dining together in the presence. Footnote: at Hampton Court there is a curious picture of Charles and Henrietta dining in the presence. This regal honour, after its interruption during the civil wars, was revived in 1667 by Charles II, as appears by Evelyn's diary. Now did his majesty again dine in the presence, in ancient style, with music and all the court ceremonies. End of footnote. Mr. Hacket, chaplain to the Lord Keeper Williams, footnote. The author of the Life of this Bishop and Lord Keeper, a voluminous folio, but full of curious matters. Ambrose Phillips, the poet, abridged it. End of footnote. Being then to say grace, the confessor would have prevented him, but that Hacket shoved him away, whereupon the confessor went to the Queen's side and was about to say grace again, but that the king, pulling the dishes onto him and the carvers falling to their business, hindered. When dinner was done, the confessor thought, standing by the Queen, to have been before Mr. Hacket, but Mr. Hacket again got the start. The confessor, nevertheless, begins his grace as loud as Mr. Hacket, with such a confusion that the king, in great passion, instantly rose from the table, and taking the Queen by the hand, retired into the bedchamber. It is with difficulty we conceive how such a scene of priestly indiscretion should have been suffered at the table of an English sovereign. Such are the domestic accounts I have gleaned from manuscript letters of the times, but particulars of a deeper nature may be discovered in the answer of the king's council to Marshal Bassompierre, preserved in the history of his embassy. This marshal had been hastily dispatched as an extraordinary ambassador when the French party were dismissed. This state document, rather a remonstrance than a reply, states that the French household had formed a little republic within themselves, combining with the French resident ambassador, and inciting the opposition members in Parliament. A practice usual with that intriguing court, even from the days of Elizabeth, as the original letters of the French ambassador of the time, which will be found in the 3rd volume, amply show, and those of La Bauderie in James I.'s time, who raised a French party about Prince Henry, and the correspondence of Barillon in Charles II.'s reign, so fully exposed in his entire correspondence, published by Fox. The French domestics of the Queen were engaged in lower intrigues. They lent their names to hire houses in the suburbs of London, where under their protection the English Catholics found a secure retreat to hold their illegal assemblies, and where the youth of both sexes were educated and prepared to be sent abroad to Catholic seminaries. But the queen's priests, by those well-known means which the Catholic religion sanctions, were drawing from the queen the minutest circumstances which passed in privacy between her and the king, indisposed her mind towards her royal consort, impressed on her a contempt of the English nation and a disgust of our customs, and particularly, as has been usual with the French, made her neglect the English language, as if the Queen of England held no common interest with the nation. They had made her residence a place of security for the persons and papers of the discontented. Yet all this was hardly more offensive than the humiliating state to which they had reduced an English queen by their monastic obedience, inflicting the most degrading penances. One of the most flagrant is alluded to in our history. This was a barefoot pilgrimage to Tyburn, where, one morning, under the gallows on which so many Jesuits had been executed as traitors to Elizabeth and James I, she knelt and prayed to them as martyrs and saints who had shed their blood in defense of the Catholic cause. Footnote: there is a very rare print which has commemorated this circumstance. End of footnote. A manuscript letter of the times mentions that the priests had also made her dabble in the dirt in a foul morning from Somerset House to St. James, her Luciferian confessor riding along by her in his coach. They have made her to go barefoot, to spin, to eat her meat out of dishes, to wait at the table of servants, with many other ridiculous and absurd penances, and if they dare thus insult, adds the writer, over the daughter, sister, and wife of so great kings, what slavery would they not make us, the people, to undergo? Footnote: Mr. Poree to Mr. Meade, July, 1626, Harleian Manuscripts, No. 383. The answer of the King's Council to the complaints of Bassompierre is both copious and detailed in Volume 3, page 166 of the Ambassades of this Marshal. End of footnote. One of the articles in the contract of marriage was that the Queen should have a chapel at St. James to be built and consecrated by her French bishop. The priests became very importunate, declaring that without a chapel mass could not be performed with the state it ought before a queen. The king's answer is not that of a man inclined to popery. If the queen's closet, where they now say mass, is not large enough, let them have it in the great chamber, and if the great chamber is not wide enough, they might use the garden, and if the garden would not serve their turn, then was the park the fittest place. The French priests and the whole party, feeling themselves slighted, and sometimes worse treated, were breeding perpetual quarrels among themselves, grew weary of England, and wished themselves away. But many, having purchased their places with all their fortune, would have been ruined by the breaking up of the establishment. Bassompierre alludes to the broils and clamours of these French strangers, which exposed them to the laughter of the English court, and we cannot but smile in observing in one of the despatches of this great mediator between two kings and a queen, addressed to the minister, that one of the greatest obstacles which he had found in this difficult negotiation arose from the bedchamber woman. The French king being desirous of having 2 additional women to attend the English queen his sister, the ambassador declares that it would be more expedient rather to diminish than to increase the number, for they all live so ill together, with such rancorous jealousies and enmities, that I have more trouble to make them agree than I shall find to accommodate the differences between the 2 kings. Their continual bickerings, and often their vituperative language, occasion the English to entertain the most contemptible and ridiculous opinions of our nation. I shall not, therefore, insist on this point, unless it shall please his Majesty to renew it. The French bishop was under the age of 30, and his authority was imagined to have been but irreverently treated by two beautiful viragos in that civil war of words which was raging, one of whom, Madame St. George, was in high favour and most intolerably hated by the English. Yet such was English gallantry that the king presented this lady on her dismission with several £1,000 and jewels. There was something inconceivably ludicrous in the notions of the English, of a bishop hardly of age, and the gravity of whose character was probably tarnished by French gesture and vivacity. This French establishment was daily growing in expense and number. A manuscript letter of the times states that it cost the king £240 a day, and had increased from 80 persons to 440, besides children. It was one evening that the king suddenly appeared, and summoning the French household, commanded them to take their instant departure. The carriages were prepared for their removal. In doing this, Charles had to resist the warmest entreaties and even the vehement anger of the queen, who is said in her rage to have broken several panes of the window of the apartment to which the king dragged her, and confined her from them. Footnote: a letter from Mr. Poree to Mr. Meade contains a full account of this transaction. Harleian Manuscripts, 383. End of footnote. The scene which took place among the French people at the sudden announcement of the king's determination was remarkably indecorous. They instantly flew to take possession of all the queen's wardrobe and jewels. They did not leave her, it appears, a change of linen, since it was with difficulty she procured one as a favour, according to some manuscript letters of the times. One of their extraordinary expedients was that of inventing bills for which they pretended they had engaged themselves, on account of the queen, to the amount of £10,000, which the queen at first owned to, but afterwards acknowledged the debts were fictitious ones. Among these items was one of £400 for necessaries for her majesty, an apothecary's bill for drugs of £800, and another of £150 for the bishop's unholy water, as the writer expresses it. The young French bishop attempted by all sorts of delays to avoid this ignominious expulsion, till the king was forced to send his yeomen of the guards to turn them out from Somerset House, where the juvenile French bishop, at once protesting against it, and mounting the steps of the coach, took his departure, head and shoulders. Footnote: a letter among Tanner's manuscript in the Bodleian Library notes, when they were turned away from Somerset House, the passage was somewhat rough, and adds, I know not what revilings took place betwixt them and the king's guard, but one of the soldiers told me that for furious speech he would rather have taken common thieves to prison. A stanza of a popular song of the day testifies to the joy of the Commons of England on the event. Hark, I tell you, news from court, mark, these things will make you good sport. All the French that lately did prance, there up and down in bravery, now are all sent back to France. King Charles hath smelt some knavery. End of footnote. It appears that to pay the debts and the pensions, besides sending the French troops free home, cost £50,000. In a long procession of nearly 40 coaches, after 4 days' tedious travelling, they reached Dover. But the spectacle of these impatient foreigners, so reluctantly quitting England, gesticulating their sorrows or their quarrels, exposed them to the derision and stirred up the prejudices of the common people. As Madame George, whose vivacity is always described as extravagantly French, was stepping into the boat, one of the mob could not resist the satisfaction of flinging a stone at her French cap. An English courtier who was conducting her instantly quitted his charge, ran the fellow through the body, and quietly returned to the boat. The man died on the spot, but no farther notice appears to have been taken of the inconsiderate gallantry of this English courtier. But Charles did not show his kingly firmness only on this occasion. It did not forsake him when the French Marshal Bassompierre was instantly sent over to awe the king. Charles sternly offered the alternative of war rather than permit a French faction to trouble an English court. Bassompierre makes a curious observation in a letter to the French Bishop of Mendi, he who had been just sent away from England, and which serves as the most positive evidence of the firm refusal of Charles I. The French marshal, after stating the total failure of his mission, exclaims, "See, sir, to what we are reduced, and imagine my grief that the Queen of Great Britain has the pain of viewing my departure without being of any service to her. But if you consider that I was sent here to make a contract of marriage observed and to maintain the Catholic religion in a country from which they formerly banished it to make a contract of marriage, you will assist in excusing me of this failure." The French marshal has also preserved the same distinctive feature of the nation, as well as of the monarch, who, surely to his honour as King of England, felt and acted on this occasion as a true Briton. "I have found," says the Gaul, "humility among Spaniards, civility and courtesy among the Swiss, in the embassies I had the honour to perform for the king. But the English would not in the least abate of their natural pride and arrogance. The king is so resolute not to re-establish any French about the queen, his consort, and was so stern, rude, in speaking to me, that it is impossible to have been more so." In a word, the French marshal, with all his vaunts and his threats, discovered that Charles I was the true representative of his subjects, and that the king had the same feelings with the people. This indeed was not always the case. This transaction took place in 1626, and when, 4 years afterwards, it was attempted again to introduce certain French persons, a bishop and a physician, about the queen, the king absolutely refused even a French physician who had come over with the intention of being chosen the queen's, under the sanction of the queen mother. This little circumstance appears in a manuscript letter from Lord Dorchester to Monsieur de Vic, one of the king's agents at Paris. After an account of the arrival of this French physician, his lordship proceeds to notice the former determinations of the king. "Yet this man," he adds, "hath been addressed to the ambassador to introduce him into the court, and the queen persuaded in clear and plain terms to speak to the king to admit him as domestic. His Majesty expressed his dislike of this proceeding, but contented himself to let the ambassador know that this doctor may return as he is come, with intimation that he should do it speedily. The French ambassador, willing to help the matter, spake to the king that the said doctor might be admitted to kiss the queen's hand, and to carry the news into France of her safe delivery, which the king excused by a civil answer, and has since commanded me to let the ambassador understand that he had heard him as Monsieur de Fontenay in this particular, but if he should persist and press him as ambassador, he should be forced to say that which would displease him." Lord Dorchester adds that he informs Monsieur de Vic of these particulars, that he should not want for the information should the matter be revived by the French court, otherwise he need not notice it. By this narrative of secret history, Charles I does not appear so weak a slave to his queen as our writers echo from each other. and those who make Henrietta so important a personage in the cabinet appear to have been imperfectly acquainted with her real talents. Charles, indeed, was deeply enamoured of the queen, for he was inclined to strong personal attachments. Footnote: the letters he sent to Buckingham are full of tender respect for the queen, lamenting her, certainly unwarrantable, neglect of reciprocity of attention, and silly squabbles in favour of her servants. End of footnote. And the temperance of his youth, by which he had lived so free from personal vice. As May, the parliamentarian historian, expresses it, even the gay levity of Buckingham seems never, in approaching the king, to have violated. Charles admired in Henrietta all those personal graces which he himself wanted. Her vivacity in conversation enlivened his own seriousness, and her gay volubility the defective utterance of his own, while the versatility of her manners relieved his own formal habits. Doubtless the queen exercised the same power over this monarch which vivacious females are privileged by nature to possess over their husbands. She was often listened to, and her suggestions were sometimes approved, but the fixed and systematic principles of the character and the government of this monarch must not be imputed to the intrigues of a mere lively and volatile woman. We must trace them to a higher source, to his own inherited conceptions of the regal rights, if we would seek for truth, and read the history of human nature in the history of Charles I. Long after this article was published, the subject has been more critically developed in my Commentaries on the Life and Reign of Charles I. End of section 57.